Pleased to be joined now with his weekly appearance, as always, by NFL analyst for ESPN, Dan Orlovsky. And Dan's segment brought to you by Ellicott Hotels. Fans, round up your family, friends, or coworkers for a fantastic game day experience at 500 Pearl. Reserve your pack, book your group event today at 500pearlbuffalo.com. All right, Dan, we're making the turn here at the midway point of the season, and it looks like the Bills have discovered something on offense based on their last performance against Tampa. They may go back to their roots to some degree, but some people feel they may have also defined some roles a little bit more effectively with what we saw from Kincaid the last 2 weeks and maybe a little bit of an emergence from Khalil Shakir.
Yeah, I think that the challenge coming off of last week, so the good of last week, obviously the tempo helped, 11 personnel, a little bit more spread out. The execution was really good. Shakir in the slot was really good. I think the challenge for Ken, and we kind of talked about this last week, was like when that 11 personnel looks good and plays well, how do they mesh it into some of the 12 stuff when Dawson comes back, you know? So I think that's going to be their biggest challenge is I don't know if there's a set answer, Chris. I don't know if it's like, hey, we got to live in 11 or we got to live in 12. I think a little bit is opponent dependent. I think a little bit is how consistently can they play in that world. I think a little bit is, how are they able to create explosives and find explosives in both of those personnel groupings. But every time, not every time, but it certainly feels like Shakir's got a worthy spot for completion-driven plays in that offense. So really good performance, much needed performance. But I don't know if I would walk away going, okay, 11 personnel is going to be who we are.
Another factor of the offense was we saw a designed quarterback run for Josh Allen on that first drive of the game. He got to use his legs a little bit, and we heard from Sean McDermott afterwards, and he said that was a focus. We wanted to get him going like that again. How much do you think, or how important do you think it is for a quarterback like Josh Allen to be able to use that facet of the game?
Yeah, Maddie, so I remember 2 years ago when it was a little bit more prevalent, and I still very much so believe this. When he's used in that capacity, he's the most indefensible quarterback in football. And that's said in respect with, and everyone knows how highly I think of Patrick. He's the best player I've ever seen in my life. And Joe Burrow and Lamar Jackson. But when Josh, is used in that way, it's almost impossible to stop him. And I think the reasons why they don't do that, I understand as much as they used to. I completely understand. And there's a lot of evidence and data and experience from Sean in Carolina that says, you got to be really smart about how you're going to do it. I think there's two things that it matters when it comes to using it more for Josh. You got to do it right. I think number one, and you learn this a little bit when you call college football games. If you ever sat down with a really good college football coach and who had a quarterback that was a really dynamic athlete, every one of them would tell you to get that guy into the flow of the game, they're going to call runs early on. They just do, because they're different than your traditional drop back passer. If we talked about drop back passers, one of the things that coaches do is they say, let's get him completions early to get him into the rhythm of the game. These ball completion efficient quarterbacks. Well, Josh is one of those dynamic quarterbacks. And if you talk to a college coach to what I'm saying, like, they'll tell you early on, we want to get him involved in the game. He just settles into the game once he takes a hit or two in regards to that. So I think there's some credence to that in Buffalo with Josh. I think the second thing, and you guys are showing these clips of, in many ways, their completions. They did not run a lot of different plays. They didn't. They ran like 5 or 6 different plays for the most part. They were 10 plus, 12 plus RPOs. But I do think that when Josh plays, and he was just on with Kevin Clark the other day and talking about like completions. When Josh plays in a way where he's just very focused on getting the ball out and throwing it to the right guy, indifferent of the situation, the explosive plays or the big plays or the playmaking opportunities present themselves so much more consistently. It's just the way the game goes in many ways. And I think that is probably the thing that you try to focus on if you're Ken Dorsey and Joe Brady.
Yeah, and to the simplification point that you just made in terms of volume of plays that the Bills ran last week, Gabe Davis said going into the game, we want to simplify this week. And then coming out of the game, he said that's what we can be when we simplify things and just let guys play fast. We're that talented. I don't know if that's necessarily 100% accurate answer, but
Yeah.
I thought maybe the most interesting thing was I saw Gabe Davis run a quick slant, maybe for the first or second time in his Buffalo career. I was like, who's this guy underneath? And they ran him on some receiver screens because it's like, all right, let's get the 225-pound receiver running a receiver screen. At least you know he can break a tackle or two and get some yards on his own. So there were some different elements sprinkled in, even though it was simple because they had different people kind of filling some unconventional roles than we're accustomed to seeing from them, Davis being a prime example. My question, though, going forward is while that tempo stuff was all great, it requires an enormous amount of communication. They got to play on the road Sunday night in Cincinnati. How realistic is it you're going to be able to do that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you are really good in your nonverbal communication and it's something that you can do seamlessly, you're absolutely capable of doing it, indifferent of where you're doing it. Outside of maybe Seattle, or Kansas City, Cincinnati will be loud, but it's all about how comfortable you feel in your ability to kind of communicate. I think that Chris, the ways that you can do it are when you say, hey, we're going to start. And once we get a first down, we're going to get into it. Like you're on defense, you force a 3-and-out, whatever. The other team punts the ball. You start with your possession. You get a first down, and then we can get into it because the noise so often in that situation is not going to be that big of a deal. The biggest focus is going to be how often or how much you can handle your third down package. Like you can call a lot of different plays from your base game plan on 3rd and 2 or 3rd and 3 in tempo because usually teams are going to be stuck in their defensive personnel. But if you get to 3rd and 6 and 3rd and 7, you probably want to have a little bit more game plan specific calls. How many of those formations and certain sets that you're kind of referencing with Gabe a little bit last week can they get to without having to huddle? That's probably their greatest challenge. And usually the case is you have to huddle in those moments. And that changes, obviously, the tempo. I don't, there's a case to be made for running a lot of the same plays on a consistent basis with different interchangeable parts. The problem is you become predictable. Like you can become, they ran the same like 2x2 RPO and 3x1 RPO like 4 or 5 times. There is a predictability to that. Now,
Right.
There's also a benefit to playing fast, but you better have, the curveball and the changeup and the slider and all the different options off of those looks to make sure that you're not incredibly predictable with your types of plays.
Yeah, so meshing that tempo with some of that unpredictability and some of the counters off of things, where do the Bills go from here offensively? Because we're sitting at week 9. They're about to have a tough stretch here with the Bengals, the Jets, the Eagles, and the Chiefs coming up in the next 4 to 5 weeks. What do you want to see from this offense as their identity really starts to take shape and take form?
Yeah, I think, obviously the 11 personnel probably is going to be the focal point for the next couple of weeks, obviously with Dawson's injury. I'll speak directly to their next, 4 weeks before the bye. I think the identity of the Bengals is going to be, I'll tell everybody right now, this defensive coordinator is as good as there is in ball, Lou Anarumo for the Bengals. And he had Kyle Shanahan figured out. And Kyle Shanahan is one of the greatest and most creative offensive minds in football. He had him figured out. I promise you, he is going to multiple times have 6 or 7 guys up at the line of scrimmage and then drop all of them. And they're going to rush 2 guys. They're going to rush 3 guys. They're going to have a ton of people in underneath coverage. And they're going to force Josh to be very patient. They're going to force Ken Dorsey to call runs. They're going to force some of the RPO looks. That's a little bit of what the Jets did to Philadelphia in their RPO game, is you take it away before the snap with bodies at the line of scrimmage. So I think identity-wise, that's where some of the tempo will present itself. I think some of the perimeter screens have to be a little bit more of the conversation. I know, Chris, we've talked about that for a couple weeks now. You burn teams at that. All you need to do is hit them once for 15 or 20 yards, and then they're like, that's a concern. The Broncos are playing better defensively, but you should go and be able to execute on a consistent basis against Denver. The Jets game, I would imagine Josh will complete, 75+% of his passes in that game, especially after what we saw week 1. And then Philadelphia is a massive game just because Philadelphia is so physical, offensive and defensive lines. I think their identity has to be RPOs. I think it has to be a little bit of tempo. I think it has to be very ball distribution focused. The challenge is going to be, where did the chunk plays from? That's going to be their challenge. Can they find ways to create chunk plays and design chunk plays rather than be reliant on Josh to making them happen?
Okay, so let's just look specifically at the next opponent here, Cincinnati, particularly on that defensive side of the ball, where I think we could agree the biggest change is at the safety positions this season. Both of the guys that started last year are elsewhere, departed in free agency, and now you have the former first-round pick Dax Hill and the veteran Nick Scott, who comes over from the Rams. How have they meshed together through the first half of the season? Are there perceived deficiencies from the veteran duo that they had a year ago?
They don't lie as well as Von Bell and Jesse Bates did, and what I mean by that is, and they're not bad at it, but Vaughn and Jesse were unbelievable with lying to quarterbacks. What's the coverage? You'd sit there, I would sit there and watch tape, and I go, I have no idea if this is cover 4 or cover 3. I got no idea if this is cover 2 or cover 4 or cover 6. You got no idea if it's cover 3 or cover 3 carry. And I know that's deep in the weeds but they're different coverages, and they tell quarterbacks to do what with the football differently. And I remember I called the Cincinnati Rams game. I think it was week 2 of the NFL season, maybe week 3. And Louis Anarumo, the defense coordinator, was like very high on player like Dax Hill and even like DJ Turner and a Cam Taylor-Britt, who are playing corner a little bit. But he was just like, they need to get playing time. They need reps, and they need that communication that, hey, if I do this, I need you to do this. And it's starting to show itself in Cincinnati. Hilton's playing awesome. Everybody's going to know about him. They're nickel. So I would say the difference is not lying as well, Chris, but not poorly. And then Dax Hill is a different athlete, though. Like he is with all due respect to Vaughn and Jesse, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. I think they're two of the better safeties in ball. He's a different athlete. I mean, he plays at a different speed than those guys did. And so the speed that he plays with and the tracking ability that he plays with, and the ability to tackle in the open field is a big deal. And their young secondary is starting to play really good football.
The Bengals start the season 1-3. They are now 4-3. They've won the last 3 games in a row, scored 31 points on the 49ers, scored 34 on the Cardinals. So they're starting to get to that high efficiency offense again. Do you think they're back? Do you think we're going to see another talented game from this offense? I know the Bills defense will present some challenges, but just looking at their offense, do you think they're back to their winning ways?
Resounding yes. Resounding. And you started to see it just a little bit before the bye week. And again, talking about Cincinnati, and everyone had written them off. And I was like, dude, all they have to do is to get to 3-3. I don't care what it looks like. Keep Joe healthy and get to 3-3 in the bye. And that showed itself this past week. I think the overwhelming thing that stood out were the 4 or 5 snaps that Joe had to go create. They ran quarterback draw with him. He got out of a crazy sack. He made 3 or 4 plays with his feet. And all of a sudden you sit there and go, if you're the rest of the seat, because they were and trying to get everyone to understand this, the calf injury for Joe affected everybody. It didn't just affect the quarterback. You know how hard it is to play offensive line when everybody on the defense knows the quarterback's going to be 6 yards behind the center and that's it. Can't move. Or how much it affects the receiver. So, yeah, he's all the way back. Their offense looks all the way back. Jamar, I think, like, if you're looking at it from the Buffalo perspective, I think the thing that has to have, obviously the movement has your attention. The thing that has your attention is how they were very strategic attacking San Francisco's nickel corner. They sat there and said, hey, San Francisco, like, you're going to play a ton of man, which is abnormal for them. And there's not a guy that we think can cover our guys. And it was like the Boyd touchdown early on. It was 100%. I'm a break tendency and attack man coverage. The Jamar touchdown, it's 100%. We just want to get him on the nickel. And I've said this to you guys, Buffalo's got to be really smart if they're going to play man coverage, because the Cincinnati, obviously, and the talent they have on the perimeter and the way that they're going about attacking certain people in man coverage is something that is very impressive.
All right, so let's take that a step further, Dan, because maybe the biggest change in this matchup from last year is McDermott's calling the defense now. Yeah. So what have you seen, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, from McDermott's defense that might present something different to this Cincinnati offense? Because I think everybody for the last 4 years has said, all right, well, the Bills are just going to line up in nickel, and here they come. There weren't a lot of surprises. There wasn't a lot of unpredictability. To what degree have they increased those quotients? And if you could, part 2, the Taylor Rapp insertion, 38% in dime last week. How much do we expect to see that going forward?
Yeah, I think, talking about after the Tampa game, that was like the interesting thing defensively. We talked about it a lot on NFL Live with Ryan Clark. It was really good to see. It certainly helped in their pass coverage. And you saw Poyer drop down. You saw Micah drop down. Taylor was often one of the deep safeties, certainly the single deep safety. And so you sat there and said, because the conversation, the coverage, how can they survive, Milano and then Tre'Davious' injury? And, it seemed the answer, against Tampa was they were going to play with those 3 safeties and have one of those very skilled veterans down in coverage, sometimes zone, sometimes man. It'll be really interesting to see if they do that versus Cincinnati. It makes a lot of sense to do it versus Cincinnati. Cincinnati does not get in a lot of unique personnels. They're going to live in a lot of 11 personnel as well, 1 back, 1 tight end. They'll live in a lot of RPO formations. They're very RPO centric right now as well for their run and their quick passing game. It makes a lot of sense to play their 3 safeties. I just don't know how much sense it makes to play man. And the last thing is Cincinnati's actually run the ball relatively well. And with those 3 safeties, you're light. You just are. And that has to have a little bit of attention as well.
Right. And that's the reason I asked it, because as we know in the playoff game last year, they ran all over them with 3 backup offensive linemen. Granted, the Bills didn't have Daquan Jones in that game either. They won't have him this week, as we know. And I think the reason we're seeing dime is because they want a better answer in coverage because they don't have Milano. I don't think they feel like Dorian Williams is ready to make the right decisions and see the things fast enough. He needs to be 100%. A good coverage linebacker, and Dotson is just a little limited in his physical skill set to be a quality coverage linebacker. So Poyer and Hyde have been flipped into that role with this dime package. But to your point, Cincinnati, the way they ran the football on this team last year, that's a concern. You can't just sit in that dime all day.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if Sean sits there and says, over the course of 4 quarters, to beat the Bengals, or to give yourself the best chance to beat the Bengals, you got to stop the pass game first. You got to cover really well. You got to tackle really well. Again, the RPOs. I'll be very interested to see if they somehow think of deploying 5 defensive linemen and playing the 3 safety look. Just to sit there and go, protect a little bit, at least the initial surge of the line of scrimmage, and allow a hat on a hat and maybe not as many offensive linemen that climb up to some of the lighter backer or safeties or secondary players that might have to be in the run conversation. That would be something that I would sit there and say, if you're going to play those 3 safeties, which I understand, like I get it. I understand it. It's easy for us to sit here and say, well, we got to figure out a replacement for Milano. Gosh, there's not a lot of humans on the planet that can. So that would be the one thing that I would, if I was the offensive team, if I was Cincinnati, that would be the wrinkle that I would go, okay, how do we handle that?
The Bills on defense and the Bengals on defense are both top 5 in terms of taking the football away. On offense, both teams rank top 10 in red zone efficiency. Bills are second and the Bengals are tied for 9th. Why are these two categories really important in a game like this?
Yeah, because right now in the NFL, the scoring is down, and so every giveaway is going to be a little, almost like 1.5, because the scoring is down, the explosive plays are down. So that's a big deal. And then obviously red zone scoring. The really interesting thing is the two teams do it differently. What's up, Mike T? Cincinnati does it off of like precision. They're very precise in the red zone. And for a passing team, Mixon's been really good running the ball down there. And Buffalo does it from Josh just being a freak. And so more often than not. And so, which one of those defenses can try to make that offense play a little bit left-handed or to their B game or the less desired style is probably going to be the most important thing. But when explosive plays are down and red zone scoring is down and takeaways, have such a tremendous amount of impact when it comes to lesser possession scoring, all that stuff. I hate those kind of cliches in the NFL because I feel like I'm paid to do so much more than tell people that it'll come down to turnovers. So I don't necessarily, I try to sit there and tell everybody like it's what the turnover leads to. If Josh throws 2 interceptions and the defense finds a way to get off the field, well, the turnovers never happened in my eyes. And so I think that's the thing is like, when the turnover happens, how it happens, and what does the other team do with it is probably the biggest focus point.
Dan, thanks as always for the time. We appreciate it. We'll catch up with you next week.
Thanks, guys. Have a good week.